Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Jonathan Metzl, the author of Prozac on the Couch, Prescribing Gender in the Era of Wonder Drugs. Welcome to Rip Rap, Jonathan.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
I must admit, this book was everything I thought it'd be, and even more since it's full of surprises. But first, I'd like to have you share with our viewers your own unique background with the unusual joint appointment at the University of Michigan in the medical school and the Women's Studies Department, and then maybe how that may have influenced the direction of your research for this project.
Sure. Well, I guess I could maybe back up a bit and say that I've kind of had a full career so far of kind of merging medical training and an interest in the humanities. Actually started when I was in medical school. I went to a BA MD program at Missouri and actually did an English BA while I was doing my medical degree, and then during my residency in psychiatry, I actually snuck away and did a master's in English. And so I've kind of got either I've got like too much free time on my hands, which is quite possible, or I've kind of cultivated an interest throughout the course of my training in merging medical and humanities sensibilities and using humanities perspectives to understand medicine and vice versa. And that really culminated when I came to the University of Michigan. I actually came here 7 years ago as part of the Robert Wood Johnson program and was studying for a PhD in American Studies while I was working in the psychiatry department. And so I was actually writing a dissertation on cultural representations of psychiatry while I was also practicing psychiatry, and really going back and forth quite literally on this campus, kind of on my bike riding back and forth, but also intellectually between these two worlds. So after finishing the PhD, I started on the job that you mentioned. I'm currently a professor in women's studies and in psychiatry, and so what that means in terms of my daily life is that I both work as an attending physician in the psychiatry outpatient clinics and also teach humanities and gender and health courses through women's studies. And those two perspectives really have helped me, I think, address what for me was the kind of originary question of the book, which was a kind of attempt on my part to come to terms with the conflicting and sometimes confusing role that psychotropic medications played in both of these spheres and in my awareness of culture. From the medical perspective, I was, I think, really trained to think about medications as concrete objects that were bought and sold and prescribed and ingested, and so I, before I probably started this project, I would have thought that in the clinic, I was relying on that kind of knowledge, my medical training, to think about what the right milligram dose of a psychotropic medication might be for a person, or what kind of side effects they might have. And at the same time, given my training in humanities and in representation and special interest in gender and representation, it became increasingly obvious to me, not that it really wasn't beforehand, that the same psychotropic medications, things like Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft, were also icons, and specifically gendered icons in American popular culture, and things that represented a whole host of conflicting meanings that really sometimes came up against the meanings that were the kind of the standard kind of medical meanings of it being a medication. And so that was an interest of mine going into this project. Also, some things happened along the way. One was that in August 1997, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration relaxed its regulation on drug advertising, which I know is something we'll talk about in a bit here. And so if I might have, before that point, thought that there was this clean divide between kind of cultural representation and medical interaction, that kind of broke down then, because ads for these same medications started to show up on television and radio and internet and things like that, and patients actually started to kind of come in and say, well, I saw this ad, and talk about these medications in very kind of cultural terms. And so it seemed like trying to kind of balance those two perspectives and think about how and why psychotropic medications became quite so popular and became both clinically relevant, increasingly so over time, and also came to accrue these very gendered meanings in American culture. I think was an interest that started the project and was one that I hopefully sustained throughout the course of it. So, I would say that.
Well, it was really fun in a way, because I was looking at my expectation to be more of a clinical approach.
Right. No, definitely not that.
And yet, the title is Prozac on the Couch, which evokes all those Freudian kinds of things. And then when we got into the narrative part, I thought, wow, what is this? And it was really, I thought, a lot of fun and very, very productive and evocative.
Right.
There's all kinds of things that you did with that. But there is that thing, and we should talk a little bit about that, about the interaction between psychoanalysis and what you call psychopharmacology.
Mm-hmm.
And you put kind of a distinct, you explore those really distinctly and position yourself in between.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to kind of go through the Freudian aspects of, psychiatry.
Right, right. Well, I think that as I kind of make clear, hopefully at different points in the book, what I'm trying to do in terms of the resonance between the kind of the psychoanalytic point and the kind of, I guess, biological point is to kind of use different source materials to rewrite some of the standard narratives that have governed the ways that the history of psychiatry is often told. And so, the key kind of clinical narrative that I was kind of hoping to call into question was this notion that there was a biological revolution in American psychiatry over the past 30 or 40 years. And by biological revolution, what I think, not only what I would mean by that, but also what I think a lot of the standard histories of psychiatry and people in my profession would mean, is that this transition from kind of the couch to pills. Pills replace the couch, people say, or something like that. So if you look at, histories that are more embedded in a kind of clinical trajectory, you can see that this narrative flow that starts with psychoanalysis in the 1950s, and of course there's a lot of evidence for that, because in the 1950s psychoanalysis was very dominant in American psychiatry. Psychoanalysts chaired all of the leading grant-making institutions and the journals, and chaired the APA Committee on Nomenclature and Statistics that helped determine the kind of terminology that psychiatrists used to talk about and diagnose mental illnesses. And so there was a very heavy kind of psychoanalytic influence through probably the 1960s. And then things began to shift when who were called kind of biological psychiatrists started to call into question the efficacy of psychoanalysis and say that, maybe human experience, and I'm overgeneralizing slightly, but human experience is not so much the result of, early life experiences with castrating mothers or frigid mothers or other kinds of very gendered developmental constructs. Instead, human experience is biologically based. It's got a biological substrate, and to treat that, you don't so much need a talking cure or years on the couch, but we can actually cure this with pills. And the reason I kind of start my answer to your question with this history is because if you look at even academic journals now, for example, they will all identify as being kind of biologically based, or the result of these kind of replacement narratives, whereby biological psychiatry was argued to replace psychoanalysis in a certain kind of way. And so what I did actually was use the same time frame as a lot of the other histories, but I told my story through popular representations, everything from Ladies' Home Journal to articles in Time, Newsweek, Cosmopolitan, psychotropic medication advertisements, works of fiction, looking at, in each of these instances, at the character of psychotropic medications. And I started to see what I thought were a lot of points in popular culture that really called into question this notion that there had been a biological revolution in terms of the ways people thought about mental illness. And I think the one key example that goes throughout most of the chapters of the book is this notion of motherhood, or that there's been this shift. And there's actually a book by Elliot Wallenstein. I don't know if you've had him on the show, but he's a psychology professor and has written this book, Blaming the Brain, that talks about how psychiatry has shifted from blaming the mother to blaming the brain. And I kind of use that as a jumping off point, because in my analysis and in the representations and the articles that I was looking at, it was impossible to escape the fact that the mother kept showing up in all of these representations, of course of psychoanalysis, but also of biological psychiatry. And so I've got these, countless examples of drug ads that show mothers that are taking care of their children as a sign of their illness, or as a sign of their cure, or articles that talk endlessly about mothers, and I would say in very kind of psychoanalytic terms. And so it's more the kind of repetition of these gender categories that interests me, and the ways that if you look at gender representations in popular culture, it actually helps you break down this notion that there's been quite as clean a shift as you might think if you just looked at scientific sources.
Well, and it's sort of amazing historical markers when you see some of the older
right.
advertisements. You think, oh my gosh. And you even mentioned the Valley of the Dolls movie.
Right.
I mean, it's just amazing. One thing you talk about is that as each new wonder drug comes into play, there's sort of this three-phased.
Right.
I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah. No, it's nice. I mean, actually, there are 2 points that are part of that. I mean, one is that, I look basically in the book at I look at the Milltown phenomenon in the 1950s really as the jumping off point of a certain kind of overlap between biological and psychoanalytic sensibilities. And the 1950s were important also because before that time, nobody really had thought that you could take a pill for outpatient kind of psychiatric problems. Things like depression, anxiety. It was kind of thought that psychotropic medications were used for inpatient, severe psychosis, things like that. And so when Milltown came to the market in 1955, the person who had invented the medication actually had to shop it around to different drug companies, because they thought, well, a pill for anxiety, nobody's going to want that. We have psychoanalysis, and that's going to work. And so there was, very little enthusiasm among drug companies until this small company, Wallace Laboratories, picked up the patent. It came out in 1955. And by the end of 1956, according to Consumer Reports, 1 in 20 Americans was taking Milltown. There was, I think one of their claims was 1 prescription per second throughout the year in 1957. And if you look at these articles, I mean, it was really amazing. So if you looked in 1954, there was no mention of any kind of, psychotropic medication. By 1957, all these articles were saying, it treats car sickness, it treats everyday anxiety, it'll help you get that big promotion at work. All these kind of amazing claims, and people just lined up for it. And the pharmacies, there are these famous signs, out of Milltown, more Milltown tomorrow. Milton Berle renamed himself Milltown Berle. There was a book, The Road to Milltown. So almost overnight, literally, this medication and this unknown category became an object of really popular desire and demand in ways that were really interesting. And almost just as quickly, 4 or 5 years later, people realized, wait, this drug is addictive and it's habit forming and we can't seem to get off of it, and there are all these bad side effects. And so prescriptions went straight up, and then they went straight down, and then there was a kind of leveling off period where several years later people thought, well, maybe our rejection of this medication was a bit too harsh, and so there was this kind of more prolonged use. And Milltown actually stayed in the I mean, you probably still get it, but it was something that was kind of quietly prescribed through the 80s. But it's really interesting to see that then if you look at Valium 10 years later, exactly the same thing. Valium comes out, all of a sudden it's the treatment for every every known problem that you can imagine, and it's really funny because a drug becomes a wonder drug when it becomes the number one drug prescribed by veterinarians. So, Valium was used again for anxiety and medical problems and veterinary problems and car sickness, all these kind of random things. Everybody was taking benzodiazepines, and then lo and behold, there was this recognition, well, actually, we're over-prescribing this medication, and it's addictive, and it's habit-forming. The mechanism goes into action, prescriptions drop off, and now we're kind of in that third phase. And really you can see the same thing with Prozac. And so I tried to kind of graph that and really tell the story of how those kind of trends, really cultural trends of desire, rejection, and then tempered use, fit into some other kind of larger cultural script about the ways that it really was ironic because I was tracing the history of psychotropic drugs, and then it kind of dawned on me, well, actually that same narrative is, you could almost map that onto kind of the Freudian narrative for the development of the psyche in a certain kind of way through the castration crisis. So I'm actually trying to overlap a psychoanalytic narrative, a cultural narrative, and this kind of acceptance and rejection of psychotropic drugs. And
sort of the euphoria of discovery, and
right.
away they go.
Right. And then all of a sudden it's like, not part of yourself anymore, and
Whoops.
that kind of thing. So yeah, and you actually see it with Prozac. Not entirely surprising, but I think in 1999 or 2000, Prozac also became the number one drug prescribed by vets. So no, I don't think
it's that veterinarian.
Exactly. But I think that Prozac's wonder drug status again was kind of achieved overnight, and all of a sudden it became the treatment for everything. So.
When that engine of advertising has had its impact.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's going to be even more, where I think there's even television advertising for some kinds of...
For many kinds.
Whoa.
Yeah.
You're watching something and all of a sudden... one of the things is, and you mentioned that a little bit, is the distinctly literary dimension to your book. And not only the number of literary works you talk about, but this whole idea of creating a new discourse of self. I thought, boy, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too because this new discourse of self that I talk about, mostly in the 5th chapter, where I look at what I call the Prozac narratives. Maybe I should say first that what I meant by Prozac narratives were literary, but I looked at both works of fiction and nonfiction, but basically accounts in which women protagonists or narrators took Prozac and discovered something about their true self. So the works I looked at were some writings by Lauren Slater, who's the author of the Prozac Diary. I looked at an essay of hers called Black Swans, and a really kind of widely disparate group of other pieces, including a short story by Pagan Kennedy, who's a writer for the Village Voice, called Shrinks, and a book called Prozac Highway by Persimmon Blackbridge, who's a lesbian performance artist, and a really kind of complex novel in which this character kind of basically decides whether or not to take Prozac throughout the course of the novel, and a few other short stories, and also some of the more high-profile Prozac narratives, such as listening to Prozac, talking back to Prozac, Prozac backlash, etc., which, I guess my book is the latest installment. But really looked at how, specifically in terms of these women's narratives, what we see in almost all of them, or all of the ones that I look at, was this discovery of what the authors would claim to be a true self. But it was always a true self that discovered a meaning beyond Prozac, but was also still on the drug Prozac. And so, for example, in the Slater piece, she has a series of very debilitating symptoms, and then finds a doctor who prescribes Prozac for her. She takes Prozac, and very much like the kind of cultural trajectory that I was talking about before, she has a euphoric initial reaction, and says it wasn't like being on a recreational drug, but it was just that she could do everything she wanted. She had complete control of herself. She felt great, and this lasts for a while, and then all of a sudden the drug stops working, and she has this a moment of almost paralysis of realizing that the drug is not the kind of panacea that she thought it was going to be. And then, according to her narrative, and it's one that's mirrored in a lot of other texts as well, she almost wills herself into a kind of, control over herself, but she also is still taking Prozac. So what interested me in terms of this trajectory, and that's really where the story ends up, is that she forces herself out of bed. She forces herself to be a productive person. The Prozac helps her, but really it's her actions, her agency that by her authorial voice are driving the narrative. And what interested me were two things about that. One, how much these individual narratives replayed the cultural trajectories that I was talking about before of euphoria, rejection, and then rationality in a certain kind of way. And also how different these kind of narratives were from if you looked at similar kinds of narratives from the 1970s, Barbara Gordon's I'm Dancing as Fast as I Can, or Kate Millett's The Looney Bin Trip, books that were written about kind of Valium and addiction and Mother's Little Helpers, they all end up saying, basically, to hell with psychotropic drugs. We don't need psychiatry. It's a controlling discourse. It's a normalizing discourse, and you should kind of reject psychiatry. And it seemed like what was being said in these Prozac narratives was actually something much different, which was not like we should reject Valium. Instead, it was Prozac has some benefits, but ultimately it's the self that we are while we're on Prozac, but beyond Prozac, that helps us be agential, that basically helps us be women narrators at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. So,
well, what fascinated me about your position, there's a line of continuity of relationships that that not magic solutions, whether it's Freudian or psychotropic drugs.
Right.
There's still the relationships part of it, and yet there's awareness about what you call the discovery of the biology beneath culture and context, and I just love that concept because it really kind of goes beneath, and there's some other parts to that concept about the present. Maybe you can talk about that it brings all consciousness, everything into the present.
Right. I mean, in a way, what I was trying to do with that was to point out, on one hand, I'm very critical of the implications, the kind of historical implications and the clinical implications of this shift, alleged shift from psychoanalysis to biology. And so what I'm doing in part is critiquing biological psychiatry, almost by saying that the pendulum has swung awfully far in one direction, which is to say 7-minute office visits and prescriptions at the expense of kind of more nuanced or deeper understandings of the patients that are seen by psychiatrists. And so part of what I was saying was that biological psychiatry and the psychiatry of medications, in a way, that's slightly an oversimplification, but the psychiatry of medications needs to come to terms with some things that were known kind of deeply by psychoanalysis and kind of thrown out in over the course of this revolution, so-called, namely that every human interaction has preconceived assumptions about power, about gender. For all of its faults, psychoanalysis, when it was in its heyday, forced this recognition through terms such as transference and countertransference, that people came to an interaction and experienced that interaction as a result of expectations that they walked into the room having, and so and also this notion that there's a kind of power imbalance, sometimes a gender imbalance between doctor and patient, or different kinds of participants in a clinical conversation. And with this shift to biological psychiatry, I think, on one hand, I agree with a lot of the critiques that were made by Hans Eisnick and other people in the 60s and 70s that, psychoanalysis couldn't elucidate its truth claims in a certain kind of way, couldn't prove that it worked. And at the same time, this notion that a prescription interaction is not also a human interaction is, I think, false. And so it's crazy to me that psychiatrists are trained to know everything about medications, but nothing about the power interactions that are at play in a room when they go in the room to prescribe them. And so part of what I was trying to say with that is that actually biological psychiatry, for all of its advances, needs to learn something about about human interactions from psychoanalysis, because, like it or not, it's in the room, and often it's in the room, ironically, in the guise of psychotropic medications, because these medications have these complex cultural meanings.
Well, and you put your finger on the issue too, that it is a uniquely gender-based discussion.
Right.
You know, that, and you point out in your book it could be males involved with it, but it does often focus on women.
Right. Right, and in predictable ways too. Sometimes, I mean, really, if I again do a lot of work with the pharmaceutical ads, because I think that it's the height of irony that it's not really real women and men that are being shown in these ads. But if we're just going for like factual information as being the decision, which is obviously a kind of humorous notion, why is it that these ads keep showing the same kind of visual iconography that's so based in these kind of gender norms? Obviously these medications are imbued with all of these meanings, and those become the primary meanings in terms of ads, for example, because otherwise the ads wouldn't work that well if they were just like, here's some medical information.
And there was all this stuff, like you mentioned, from Miltown to Valium to Prozac, and as we've been talking about, a key to understanding ourselves lies through the relationships. It was really fascinating to see all those different ads. It was, and you realize the sort of the cumulative effect of how all that worked.
Right. I mean, one of the ones that I liked the best in the book is this ad that was inside the front. It was a Librium ad from the front cover of the Archives of General Psychiatry, one of the leading psychiatric journals, from 1972. And all of the articles in this particular issue were saying, psychoanalysis is dead, Freud is dead. We might have thought before that the castrating mother or the, that kind of thing is, was the way to go about it. But really, we've got these medications now, and so medications are the way of the future. And at the same time that they're making these very biological arguments about neurotransmitters and molecules and etc., there are these ads in the front of the journal that show enormous, gigantic, oversized women and teeny little men, and this notion that basically that the mothers were causing anxiety. These powerful mothers were causing these teeny little men to feel anxiety and tension, and either the men should be taking the Librium or the mothers should be taking the Librium. Nonetheless, it was just very ironic that that they might have claimed in the articles that there's this new kind of biological paradigm, but in terms of marketing and kind of representing these, they fell back on the exact same gender paradigms that psychoanalysis was being kind of debunked for and rightly critiqued for. So they couldn't really sell Librium without using the castrating mother and the castrated son and all these other things that, so it's that overlap that really interested me. So yeah, thank you.
Well, I thought it was a very provocative book, and actually as I was preparing for this interview, I finally got what it meant about Prozac on the couch.
Prozac on the couch hopefully gets at kind of the same thing, which is just trying to look at the psychoanalysis of psychotropic medications, the kind of gender implications of these capsules that in all other regards seem to be entirely chemical and molecular.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it very much.